collaborating with the Canadian Council on Social Development on the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index initiative. I will be your chair for the webinar today. For the next hour, we will be introducing you to the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index and its accompanying data visualization tool. We will also be inviting valuable feedback from you about how the index, mapping tool, and other potential products and services can be made as accessible and useful as possible to your organizations. Before we begin, though, I'd like to thank Central One for helping us to organize today's webinar and for reaching out to its membership on our behalf. And we're delighted to have so many credit unions joining us today, because credit unions play a critical role in building financial health for their members and more broadly in supporting financial empowerment efforts in communities across Canada. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to receiving your feedback as we move through the webinar today. On to logistics. Because we're very interested in your feedback, we will be pausing periodically during the webinar to seek your opinion on aspects of the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index. We'll do this through poll questions that appear on your screen. So when prompted, simply click on your preferred response to the question as they appear. You will have approximately 1 minute per question. If you have questions at any time, please use the question box on the control panel on your screen and just type in your question. We'll try to answer logistical questions as these come up, and have also set aside time in the agenda to answer your questions about the index itself. But because we may not have time to get to all of your questions today, we will follow up and prepare written responses to any outstanding questions and circulate them to all the participants after the webinar. Moving on to the agenda, we have 4 main topics we'd like to cover today. First, to introduce you to the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index and its accompanying online data visualization or mapping tool. Secondly, to share with you how the index was developed and the kind of data that it captures. Third, to give you a live demonstration of the mapping tool and what it can do for you. And finally, we'll be polling you so you can share your perceptions on the potential value of the index to your work and on some subscription and pricing options. Tomorrow, we'll also be sending you an email link to a follow-up survey with a few more detailed questions that allow you to provide qualitative responses and written comments. These questions will help us ensure our final product really meets your needs. Will also help us develop a sustainable business plan that will enable us to make this important data available to as many communities as affordably as possible. Your feedback is deeply essential to us, so thank you in advance for taking a few minutes to share your thoughts and suggestions and for helping us by joining our webinar today. Moving on to the next slide. So what is the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index? The index is a brand new composite measure of financial health at the neighborhood level. Its purpose is to give us an accurate picture of household financial health at the neighborhood and community level, something we have never had before in Canada. This is important because without local data, it's very hard for communities to see the distribution of financial health and vulnerability across neighborhoods and to do something about it. The mapping tool we've developed and will be showing you today takes this to the next level, making the index data accessible and intelligible for a wide range of users who may not have the resources or expertise to analyze the underlying source data itself. The Neighbourhood Financial Health Index is a collaboration of many partners. The idea originated with the Canadian Council on Social Development, and Prosper Canada has been pleased to partner with CCSD to move this initiative forward. The data used in the tool are provided to us by Environics Analytics, and Catherine from CCSD will tell us more about the data shortly. This project has also been supported by a wide range of community and business partners: the City of Toronto, Fuse Social in Fort McMurray, the TD Bank Group, United Way Toronto and York Region, Vibrant Communities Calgary, the Regional Municipality of Peel, and the Regional Municipality of York. In terms of why we undertook the development of the index, there are really 3 main reasons. First is that income only tells part of the story when it comes to Canadian household financial health. Savings, assets, and debt are equally important in determining the real financial health of Canadian households, but we typically rely on income data alone to see how families and neighborhoods are doing. Secondly, we need community-level data to drive community-level action. To date, though, when it comes to accessing household financial data, this has only been available at the national scale, leaving us blind when it comes to seeing and analyzing what's actually happening to families in our communities. We also need comparable data across the country to catalyze and inform new policies and investments to build the financial health of struggling households, and to ensure the solutions we develop are tailored to the different contexts and realities across Canada. Our vision is to enable policymakers, funders, and community stakeholders to understand the extent and distribution of financial health and vulnerability in their communities, and to design effective policies, programs, and interventions to build financial health and resilience where it doesn't now exist. In terms of the objectives for the Financial Health Index, the index, mapping tool, and other related research and services that we have in mind have been developed with three key objectives. First, the index will generate knowledge about the distribution of financial health and vulnerability in our communities and some of the underlying drivers of financial vulnerability and disparities. As Canadians continue to report high levels of uncertainty about the future, the index has been designed to deepen our understanding of current trends, exploring the issue of financial security and its spatial distribution. Second, we hope the index will help engage communities and policymakers alike and catalyze an informed dialogue about financial health and vulnerability in Canada. Finally, we hope this new data will help us to significantly improve our impact through more effective policies and programs to reduce financial vulnerability, better targeted interventions in communities to build financial resilience, and the ability to see whether our collective efforts are achieving the desired impact in our communities over time. In short, we believe the index will fill a critical gap in our knowledge base when it comes to financial security in Canada. We also hope that it will enable us to become more effective in our efforts to reduce financial vulnerability across Canada over time. This has been a long and winding road to bring us to where we are today with the index. CCSD first approached us at Prosper Canada in 2012 with this idea. So we worked on putting together some funding support from some early partners and began the actual development of the index in 2013. And at that stage, what we focused on was broad consultations with key experts and prospective users, conducting a comprehensive literature review to inform the overall concept for the index as well as the methodology, developing an initial methodology for the index, and building a prototype mapping tool. In our second phase, we secured additional funding that enabled us to further test and refine the methodology, and very importantly, to undertake an independent peer review. It was very important to us that we subject the methodology in our approach to independent scrutiny by people who are widely regarded as experts in working with this type of data in order to understand the weaknesses of the approach that we were proposing at the time and how we could strengthen it, and also to get independent validation that the tool itself was a valid approach to measuring financial health in communities across the country. We're pleased to report that we did receive lots of good critical feedback, and that this led to strengthening the tool, but that the reviewers were also supportive of moving ahead with this initiative. In addition to the peer review, we piloted the index and the mapping tool in Toronto, Calgary, and Wood Buffalo. And through that process, we continue to improve the mapping tool based on the feedback we received from our local partners. We are now happily in the third, and we hope, final development phase of the tool. In this last year, we're really focused on finalizing the mapping tool. We've engaged York and Peel Region as new community partners. And we are developing a website to host the index and mapping platform. In this phase, we're also developing a business plan to support the sustainable rollout of the index with a target public launch in May or June of this year. These webinars are actually critical to our market research and our efforts to make the index as useful and as accessible as possible. So thank you very much for participating and for sharing your thoughts today through the polling questions, and hopefully tomorrow through our follow-up survey that you'll receive through an email. I'd like to now invite Catherine Scott from the Canadian Council on Social Development to tell us more about the nature of the index, how it was developed, and the different benefits it will offer to subscribers. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks so much, Liz. I'm muted. I appreciate the opportunity to be participating in this webinar today and to help introduce the Financial Health Index to our participants. As Liz has noted, we've been involved in developing the index over a couple of years now, and it's been an exciting and interesting journey, and we're looking very forward to launching it in the near future. A good chunk of that work, of course, has been developing the particular methodology for creating the index, drawing on the expertise on our steering group as well as external experts to help us develop a tool or an index that will tell the story of community financial health in communities across the country. What I'm going to start with, certainly, is our conceptual model and the building block for the index. We wanted, as Liz noted earlier, to create a measure or an index that would help us expand our understanding of financial health in communities by drawing in not only information about household income, but taking into consideration other key determinants such as debt and assets. So we've developed a conceptual model for the framework that for our index that brings together consideration of income, debt, assets, and source or levels of financial stress at the neighborhood level. These four core concepts are the foundation for the index. We'll click to the next, we'll zip down to the next slide. On this slide, you'll see that we have, through the process and consultation, arrived at 6 indicators that we're using to measure our 4 core concepts. The index includes a measure of household income, and you'll see the definition there on the screen, which obviously is total income, including all employment income, government, and the like, before tax. As well, we've included 2 measures of assets. We have a measure of liquid assets, as well as real estate assets, noting the very importance that obviously these assets have, liquid assets being immediately available to households, for instance, experiencing economic shocks, and certainly real estate represents more of a long-term source of wealth for families that they can convert to support retirement or perhaps invest in education and the like. So having a measure of these 2 types of assets was really important to us. As well, we have 2 indicators that gauge a household's debt, mortgage debt and consumer debt. And again, it was very important. The external reviewers really emphasized how important it was to make this distinction in our index to help tell the story of household finance. Mortgage debt has been described, and certainly this audience will have heard this as good debt, debt that is an investment, can be an investment in a household's economic future, and consumer debt, which can be crippling or a real threat to financial security. Lastly, we include a measure of financial distress. Now, because we're looking at the neighborhood level, this measure is really a proxy for a neighborhood poverty measure. So we're looking at the percentage of households in a neighborhood that are low income, as defined as those households with incomes below $30,000 per year. We can go to the next slide. In creating this index, we've taken our 6 indicators and we assess their neighborhood performance on these 6 measures, adding them together, and particularly with a weight and consideration given to particularly low-income households and a concentration of low-income households, that is, financial distress. The index permits, or the performance of each of these indicators is measured against one of 2 benchmarks. The first is the community benchmark. So we have 5 pilot communities. So we've looked at generated scores that are based on the performance of neighborhoods, for instance, in York Region against others in York Region. We also have a national benchmark, which allows us to compare neighborhoods across Canada. All of the neighborhoods in a particular community are then grouped and ranked according to their index score, shaded either red, which would suggest that they're in poor financial health at the bottom of the bottom 20% of the index scores, or they have moderate financial health, which on our mapping tool are shaded orange and yellow, or they are in good financial shape, and then thus on our mapping tool are shaded green. And this represents the top 60% of neighborhoods. Go to the next slide. For this exercise, a good part of what we did in the development phase was to review available sources of community-level financial information. And as you'll be well aware, that there are actually not very many sources of financial information down at the neighborhood level. We formed a partnership with Environics Analytics that produces a product called Wealthscapes, a data set called Wealthscapes, which provides comprehensive financial information on, in this case, 112 variables at the neighborhood level. This information is, Environics produces information for dissemination areas, and those are communities, that's a census geography, those are roughly communities of between 500 and 700 people. And they do this through their own advanced estimation techniques, creating these variables based on other surveys and the census. So this particular data product is built through the use of other data products from Statistics Canada, the credit agencies, and the like. We've used this data set in its most recent version, which is, they've called it Vintage 2015, which is based on information gathered and analyzed in December 2014. So these are the most recent and up-to-date figures that we have available on several financial variables. You can get the next slide. What we've done through this project, and certainly as Liz noted, there was a significant gap we believed that this tool could help us. So we've created a product we think is quite unique in Canada, and it's certainly the first tool to our knowledge that has been created for looking at financial health at the community level. We think and evaluated the idea, certainly the idea of creating an index, because it really creates a way to tell a community story. Provides a window and helps us to understand the different variables that impact households and neighborhoods and their financial health. The partners in our project will have access to what is a unique data set, as well as the research products that we hope to generate by way of community analysis and trend analysis for across Canada based on this research, and the tool itself, the mapping tool itself, which my colleague Michelle will be showing to you. It's been an exciting journey, and certainly one we've been happy to explore with Prosper Canada and our partners. We're close to the finish, but we believe and hope that you'll be excited about what we've been able to accomplish. I would like also to say that there's a relatively lengthy methodology report that we're more than happy to share with people who are interested in our project, which lays out in much grimmer detail and much more detail the processes that we undertook to identify the indicators, conceptual framework, weighting normalization, all of the technical details behind the index, and how we've transformed that into a mapping tool, hopefully, that will have broad public use and appeal and help us to move the yardstick forward on creating tools and programs that help those communities and households in most financial need. Thanks.
Unmuted.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for taking us through this. We're now going to hand the presentation over to Michelle Fromovich, the lead for CCSD's Community Data Program, who will take us through a visual demonstration of the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index mapping tool. Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you, Catherine, for setting up the presentation of the mapping tool itself.
Muted.
It's going to set this up in full screen, and it now should be visible to all. So what you are looking at is what we're calling the visualization of the underlying data and the scores that have been produced using the methodology just described for you. The mapping tool is designed as a publicly accessible aspect of the project, and I'm going to walk you through how it is currently designed and what it's designed to do. It is in development. This is version 2. There's a third version that's coming, so some of the features here are still at the prototype stage. We are very much looking for feedback from you and from other users as to what works, what doesn't work, what could be designed differently. But I'll take a few minutes to walk you through this. I'll explain a bit about the kind of data that project partners would have access to, and then we'll go to some polls to ask you some questions. So the first feature, just to emphasize the developmental stage, is on the upper left corner, which is a search function which is not yet programmed. We're collecting feedback on how information can be searched, but the options we're considering would include looking for street addresses or looking for a dissemination area if you're more of a researcher. The key feature here is the ability to click on any given neighborhood in a given city. In this case, we're in Calgary, and I've just clicked on I'm calling them neighborhoods. They're in fact dissemination areas with populations of 500 to 700. This given neighborhood has a score that was assigned to its methodology, and that score then generates a rank. So out of close to 1,900 neighborhoods in Calgary, this one neighborhood ranks 135. Now that number suggests that it's relatively financially healthy, and the color green also denotes a financially healthy neighborhood, which is why in the legend from dark red to dark green, this one appears as pretty dark green. Now the index that was built uses, of course, 6 indicators. Each of the rows below highlights and explains how this given neighborhood was scored and ranked for each of 6 indicators. And the reason this particular neighborhood scored as well as it did and ranked as high as it did has to do with a very high average income, very large quantity of liquid assets, strong real estate assets as well, and a very low proportion of the neighborhood with incomes below $30,000. It did score rather poorly on mortgage debt, which is not surprising. The high real estate assets still have mortgages attached to them on average, and it scored relatively low on consumer debt as well, which is not unusual for neighborhoods with high incomes. The numbers you see here, community average 125,000, is the average figure for this particular community, for Calgary, for household income. And each of the averages below, again, would be numbers for the overall community. A second feature on the very top is the ability to switch between benchmarks. So Catherine mentioned that we're looking at 2 different benchmarks. If you click on the national benchmark, the numbers are going to change. And what you'll see then is the national average household income of 87,000, which corresponds to the Canadian average. And again, the averages below for each has changed as well. Another feature would be the ability to zoom in, put your neighborhood in context. The neighborhood we're looking at here is surrounded by financially healthy neighborhoods. If we want to consider a different part of the city, or over on this neighborhood, which is very well. In fact, out of close to 1,900 neighborhoods in Calgary, this one ranks close to the bottom. It gets not brightest of reds. It's in the 2nd decile, or relatively vulnerable, 1,642 out of 1,894. And again, the story here, I'll just switch the benchmark back to community. And the story here as to why this particular neighborhood ranks as low as it does and is as vulnerable as it is not so much because of household income. Its household income is below average, but not terribly below average. In fact, it has a lot to do with both a high proportion of households in financial distress with very low incomes, as well as a very high level of mortgage debt in this neighborhood. And so again, this is an interesting example of a neighborhood that wouldn't normally appear as being very vulnerable because its household income isn't that low, although its financial distress level is. But there's a debt dynamic occurring in this neighborhood. I'll just look at one neighborhood immediately above it, which ranks slightly lower. And in this case, the incomes, there seems to be a phenomenon of high or modest average household income, where a significant proportion of households actually have very low incomes, which again is keeping this particular neighborhood at a high level of vulnerability. One other feature in this mapping tool, which I will look at, well, actually a couple more. One is that if you want to change what you see in the map and the distribution for the overall community, you can click to the right of each of these individual indicators and get a sense of the distribution, in this case of income, or if you want to look at the distribution of consumer debt and zoom in on neighborhoods that have a high debt profile, consumer debt profile, you can do that as well. So if we just take a look at some of the communities here that have a very high debt. This one ranks very high despite its high debt, and that's because in this case it has extremely high average incomes and a very comfortable amount of liquid and real estate assets. So in this case, the high levels of consumer and mortgage debt are offset by very positive indicators in all other areas. And so if you were to look at the overall index and how it is profiled from just from a color point of view, it's actually a very financially healthy neighborhood surrounded by other very financially healthy neighborhoods that can handle a very high debt level. Finally, there are other communities participating in the project. What I will do is zoom over to Toronto. So the drop-down allows you to navigate from community to community, and Toronto, of course, is much larger than Calgary. There are far and for example, this is this neighborhood, the bottom, 3,552 of 1,680. And its profile, again, from a point of view, that index is made up of a very low average household income, very few assets, liquid and real estate assets, and very high levels of financial distress. Not surprisingly, consumer debt and mortgage debt are relatively low, so they score relatively high on those two factors. But on the whole, this neighborhood ranks very low and is considered to be very vulnerable. So that's a quick tour of the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index, which be wrapped in an overall website. But the point here is to emphasize how data can be used. This particular tool is meant for a general audience. It would be publicly accessible is how it's currently being conceived. It provides some ability to collect information about a range of neighborhoods that allows you to tell a much richer story about vulnerability beyond income. It also allows you then to engage your partners in that discussion about financial health, financial vulnerability, where you look at the impact of debt and the role that assets play in addition to income. So informing, engaging, using the mapping tool to do that, and ultimately having an impact on policy by using the Financial Health Index to inform the design of policies, the design of programs. What partners in the project will get beyond the mapping tool is the underlying data. That would be the dollar figures associated with each of these neighborhoods, the scores that have been applied to each neighborhood, the associated ranks, and allowing to go into much deeper analysis if you have the capacity to do so, to begin to inform policies, design programs, conduct more sophisticated comparisons and analyses within a given city in comparison to other cities participating in the project. And with that, I will stop here for a moment and hand over the reins back to Liz. We're going to ask you a few questions in a poll. And again, just to repeat, any feedback is welcome. I'm not sure if you've been given access to the URL for this mapping tool, but it is publicly accessible, and we're looking for any feedback we can get from users. So thank you, and I'll hand it back for the poll.
Unmuted.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And in the invitation that you received to this webinar, there was the URL for the tool. So hopefully some of you have had a chance to click into it and explore a little bit, but if you haven't, it's right up there on the screen right now. I'd just like to emphasize also that with the source data that comes with a subscription to this tool, once it's released, credit unions will also be able to, I think, have a better sense for the catchment areas that they're serving, understanding kind of the makeup of these neighborhoods and the places where their members live, and to have a better appreciation for, the communities and the financial circumstances of the populations they're drawing their members from. So, and hopefully that will enable you to serve your members better. We'd like to now move to the polling questions. So I'll just remind you that you have 1 minute to answer each question. They'll come up on your screen automatically. We're just going to do 3 questions now, and simply click on the answer that is most appealing to you, and then we'll move through them fairly briskly. Thank you.
Muted. Unmuted.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your feedback. As you've been watching, some of you may have questions that have sprung to mind. So we'd like to take a few minutes now to take a few questions from the floor, so to speak. So if you have a question, just type it into the question text box at the side of your webinar screen. But maybe while we're waiting for folks to type in their questions, we can explore some questions that have come up in other webinars that may be helpful to you. So one question that we got is it possible to export the data, the underlying source data, onto other mapping tools or for purposes of analysis into other software, and can we layer other data on top of it? So Michelle or Catherine, perhaps I could hand it over to you to respond to that. Maybe Michelle?
Sure. Project participants
Muted.
have access to the full set of underlying data, and we've decided to acquire data at the dissemination area level of census geography. For those of you familiar with that, it would allow for direct comparisons with census, long-form census data coming out of the 2016 census, and it certainly, if you were using a geographic information system, would be designed for an overlay. We don't anticipate necessarily having an export feature built into the mapping tool, in part because it's meant as a publicly accessible tool, but certainly project partners would have, again, full access to the data, and it would be intended for use with other data sets at the dissemination area level or larger.
Unmuted.
Great, thank you very much, Michelle. We have a question from a participant. How is the local cost of living and local cost of housing measured and taken into account? Catherine, could you speak to that, please?
Certainly.
Muted.
In the current measure that we constructed there, it does not take into account the local cost of living. The value of real estate is certainly taken into account, but at this time, our hope is actually to use this, the index in conjunction with other sources of local information to help flesh out the community picture.
Unmuted.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. How relevant do you think the index will be at a more rural level? So, and this has come up in other webinars. People are concerned about kind of the sample size in rural communities, et cetera. Catherine, again, do you want to speak to that, or Michelle?
Certainly,
Muted.
that we chose to focus at the DA level was in order to be able to have information for all of Canada, potentially. Obviously, the dissemination areas in rural areas are much larger, geographically speaking. There are larger, but they are certainly included. And again, the hope is that in conjunction with other sources of information, this tool will be very useful in shining a light on the conditions in rural areas. We don't have any rural communities participating in our pilot in the developmental phase, but certainly that's our intent to look forward. Hopefully we'll have new rural partners coming on. Interestingly, because we're looking at census divisions, the communities themselves, some of those areas will have rural outlying areas, certainly in Wood Buffalo and the like, and you're able to compare the makeup of those communities with more urban neighborhoods in within the confines of the pilot project, the pilot partners we're working with right now.
Unmuted.
Well, if you have something to add on that.
Well, I can just reinforce the point that the dissemination area is the smallest geography that
Muted.
require, and rural and remote communities being what they are, by definition, there will be a much larger area that we're working with. 500 people in a rural area are spread across a much larger area, obviously, than 500 people in downtown Toronto. But the dissemination area is a building block that is designed for use in any community, anywhere in Canada. And in fact, the participating communities outside of Toronto have significant rural components to them, including Wood Buffalo, Calgary, and even northern parts of York Region and Peel Region.
Unmuted.
Great, thank you very much, Catherine and Michelle. We had a question in another webinar that may be interesting to people as well, about whether or not the index takes into account or includes student debt in the financial indicators. Catherine, you want to speak to that?
Certainly, the
Muted.
estimates we have for the different types of debt do in fact include, well, obviously not mortgage debt, but student debt would be included in the consumer debt variable or the indicator. All of any source, it doesn't really depend on the particular source other than the distinction we've made between mortgage debt and consumer debt. All debt is captured in this, in our measure.
Muted.
Great, thank you very much. We don't have any more questions coming from the floor, so perhaps we can move along now. If you do have more questions, though, you can type them in at any time, and what we'll do is any questions that we're not able to deal with today, we will follow up with you in writing, and we'll just compile any questions that went unanswered. We'll formulate responses and we'll circulate it to the entire group of participants here today. So we care about your questions and we will get back to you. You can also feel free to contact us. Our contact information will come up at the end of the webinar on the slide. And we're certainly open to discussion or answering questions at any time. So please feel free to contact either Michelle or Catherine at CCSD or myself. Great. So moving along now, I'd like to introduce Steve Eyre from Common Good Strategies. Steve is a consultant who is working with us on the development of a business plan to ensure that the index is sustainable going forward. And he's developed a number of questions to help us really determine more about your preferences and specifically around what an optimal pricing and purchasing arrangements might look like for the tool. So these are just some initial questions. We will be following up with a survey that will send you a link to tomorrow in an email where you can provide more expanded feedback to us and suggestions on different features of the tool, aspects that you like, that you don't like, what you'd like to see that may be missing, and really give us a more fulsome picture of what you'd like to see. But for now, we're going to focus on some fairly straightforward questions. So I'd like to turn it over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. So we're quickly going to go through 7 questions that will be shown to you individually, one by one. Again, you'll have 1 minute for every question. These questions are to help us figure out what the optimal price point is and help us figure out a business model that will be sustainable. So all that we ask is you answer each question honestly. So we just want to make sure that if at any price point you see or any of the different options you see in front of us that you're answering, we have no interest in hearing that you'd be interested in buying something if you wouldn't. So that's all we're asking. Thank you.
Muted. Unmuted.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts with us. This data will be very helpful for us as we try to understand your preferences and make sure that we're tailoring our product and the pricing to fit your needs. So thank you so much for joining us today in the webinar as well. Tomorrow you'll receive an email with a link to a few more survey questions about the tool and your thoughts. This will be a bit more detailed and give you a chance to tell us more and to give us your suggestions. A recording of this webinar will also be available to everyone after it has concluded. You'll be sent the link and you're welcome to share it with anyone you wish who you think might be interested. We'll also follow up with you about any questions that may not have been answered. That we have not been able to answer today, but really the door is always open, so feel free to email or call us at any time if you'd like to talk about this more. We certainly welcome the chance to be in touch with all of you about this project. So here's our contact information. And if there's anything that we didn't talk about today that you're curious about or would like to know more about, we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you again for joining us today, and thank you again, a huge thank you to Central One for helping to facilitate this webinar. Have a wonderful afternoon. Good day, everybody.